In an age when Hollywood's brightest lights burn hottest, there were a few stars who quietly turned their backs on fame's glittering promises. They vanished from the red carpet, abandoned the spotlight, and traded champagne galas for windswept ranches, hidden islands, and remote mountain hideaways. These were the legends who dared to disappear, who lived life on their own terms, far from the hungry eyes of the press. But as you'll see, one of them didn't just leave Hollywood behind. They vanished in a way that will leave you absolutely stunned. Stick with us until the end. You won't believe who it was. Marlon Brando, the island king who turned his back on Hollywood. Marlon Brando was not just an actor, he was a force of nature. From a streetcar named Desire to The Godfather, his performances didn't just win awards, they changed acting forever. Directors called him a genius, critics called him unpredictable, and audiences couldn't look away. Yet for all the adoration, Brando found Hollywood exhausting. The parties, the politics, the endless demands, he wanted none of it. So in the late 1960s, Brando began his great escape. In the turquoise waters of French Polynesia, he discovered Tetiaroa, a small, unspoiled atoll surrounded by coral reefs and untouched beaches. Where others saw a postcard view, Brando saw freedom. He bought the island outright, not as a luxury getaway, but as a private sanctuary. Here there were no paparazzi, no scripts, no studio bosses, just the sound of wind through palm trees and the ocean stretching into infinity. Brando embraced the island life completely. He learned from the local Tahitian community, cultivated the land, and spent long stretches of time there with no connection to the outside world. While Hollywood continued to chase him with offers, he often ignored them, preferring the simple rhythm of island days. In the end, Brando's greatest role might have been this one, the man who rewrote his own script, turning away from fame to live on his own terms, in a paradise the rest of the world could only dream about. Steve McQueen, the king of cool who chose the quietest life. Steve McQueen was Hollywood's ultimate rebel. On screen, he was the man in motion, racing cars, leaping fences, defying danger with a squint and a half-smile that made him the definition of cool. Audiences adored him, and studios lined up with offers that promised fame, fortune, and a lifetime in the spotlight. But McQueen had a different dream. By the late 1970s, after years of blockbuster success, he began turning away from the Hollywood machine. The limelight had its price, endless public scrutiny, the pressure to stay at the top, and a lifestyle that left him restless. So he disappeared to Idaho. On a sprawling, remote ranch surrounded by mountains and sky, McQueen traded film sets for open fields. Days were measured not by call sheets, but by the sound of a motorcycle engine starting at dawn or the slow rhythm of horses moving through pasture. McQueen lived simply. He chopped his own wood, worked on his own vehicles, and rode into town rarely, usually unnoticed under a worn cap and dusty jacket. He kept a small circle of friends, and even they knew not to expect calls or visits without warning. It was here, far from the sound stages of California, that Steve McQueen found his version of peace. Not in applause or flashing cameras, but in the hum of an engine on an empty dirt road, and the freedom that came from living entirely on his own terms. Greta Garbo, the woman who closed the curtain forever. Greta Garbo wasn't just a Hollywood star, she was a phenomenon. In the 1930s, her name was whispered with reverence in every cinema across the globe. She was elegance personified, the woman whose presence could silence a room, and whose performances lingered in the minds of audiences long after the credits rolled. At the very peak of her career, when studios begged for more and fans couldn't get enough, she did something unthinkable. She walked away. No grand press conference, no carefully crafted farewell tour, just a quiet exit from a stage of public life. Garbo chose New York City as her sanctuary, retreating to a modest apartment where the noise of Hollywood could no longer reach her. She became a ghost in plain sight, drifting through Central Park in oversized coats, wide-brimmed hats, and dark sunglasses. Photographers hunted for her, but she knew the art of disappearing. Even her closest friends saw her rarely, maybe once a year, if at all. Yet this wasn't exile. Garbo embraced the solitude, finding beauty in the everyday, early morning walks, quiet afternoons with a book, and the freedom to exist without an audience. Her most famous on-screen line, "I want to be alone," became not just a quote, but her truth. And in the decades that followed, she proved that sometimes the boldest act a star can make is to simply vanish. Gene Tierney, the star who chose the wide-open silence. Gene Tierney was one of the most striking screen presences of the 1940s. Her beauty was the kind that casting directors called once in a generation, and her performances in films like Laura and Leave Her to Heaven made her a household name. But behind the glamour, Tierney longed for something the film industry could never give her: true, uninterrupted peace. After years of working under the relentless pace of studio contracts and navigating the pressures that came with fame, she made a decision few could imagine. Tierney left the bustling coasts and retreated to Texas, where the horizon seemed to stretch forever. Her home wasn't a glittering mansion, but a ranch where days began with the sun's rise and ended with the cicadas singing in the dark. She learned the rhythms of rural life, tending to the land, riding horses, and spending hours outdoors without a camera in sight. Friends described her as calm and grounded there, living without the constant intrusion of reporters or industry demands. Visitors were rare, and life slowed to a pace that most Hollywood stars wouldn't recognize. On that ranch, Tierney found a sense of control over her own story. She was no longer a figure for public consumption. She was simply Jean, living beneath vast skies, far from the noise of the world she once ruled. And in that quiet, she discovered the kind of freedom that can't be bought, only chosen. Gary Cooper, the gentleman who rode off to the mountains. Gary Cooper was the very image of the classic American hero. Tall, understated, and effortlessly charismatic, he became one of the most beloved stars of Hollywood's golden age. His performances in films like High Noon and Sergeant York earned him awards, admiration, and a permanent place in movie history. But as the years went on, Cooper began to value something far more than fame: space. Space to breathe, space to live, and space without the constant hum of Hollywood. His escape was Sun Valley, Idaho, a mountain town that offered both beauty and solitude. There, he owned a rustic ranch that looked out over sweeping meadows and snow-capped peaks. Days began with the smell of pine in the air, and the only studio noise came from the wind moving through the grass. Cooper traded tuxedos for worn boots, and instead of film premieres, he attended small-town gatherings where neighbors saw him as just Gary, not a movie star. He hunted, fished, rode horses, and welcomed close friends who understood the appeal of quiet living. His time in Sun Valley wasn't about hiding. It was about returning to the kind of life that had shaped him long before the cameras. In the shadow of those mountains, Gary Cooper found a different kind of role. Not the hero riding into town to save the day, but the man who'd already found his happy ending, far from the spotlight, exactly where he wanted to be. Clark Gable, the king who traded his crown for a ranch. Clark Gable was Hollywood royalty. Dubbed the King of Hollywood, his roles in films like Gone with the Wind cemented him as one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Audiences adored him, and studios treated him like gold. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Gable wasn't interested in the endless parties or the glittering nightlife. His sanctuary was a world away from the glitz, a sprawling ranch in Encino, California. There, the stars swapped tailored suits for work shirts and jeans. Instead of bright lights, he had open skies. Instead of scripts, he had fishing rods, saddles, and quiet evenings on the porch. Gable loved working the land, tending to his horses, taking long hunting trips, and losing himself in the rhythm of ranch life. He kept his circle small, inviting only trusted friends to join him for a drink or a card game under the stars. The ranch was more than a getaway. It was the place where Gable could shed the weight of being the king. Here he was simply Clark, a man who could ride out into the hills without a single photographer in sight. While the world remembered him for his swagger on screen, those who knew him best saw the man who valued the sound of a creek over the roar of an audience. And for Clark Gable, that was the real reward, not fame, but freedom. Henry Fonda, the quiet strength of the open range. Henry Fonda was the embodiment of quiet strength on screen. In The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men, his steady presence and moral conviction made him one of Hollywood's most respected actors. But when the final scene wrapped and the applause faded, Fonda sought out a life that couldn't have been further from a spotlight. His haven was in Montana, wide open land beneath a sky that seemed to go on forever. On his ranch, he wasn't a leading man. He was a neighbor, a rider, and a man who took genuine pleasure in the smallest details of country life. Mornings were filled with the scent of coffee and wood smoke, afternoons spent riding across open fields, and evenings watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. He relished the simplicity, fixing fences, mending gear, and trading Hollywood scripts for the steady rhythm of the seasons. Fonda's Montana life was not about cutting himself off entirely. He still worked when a project truly interested him. But when the camera stopped, he vanished into that big sky country, unreachable unless you knew exactly where to look. Friends often remarked that they saw the Real Henry there, relaxed, smiling easily, without the weight of the industry pressing on him. For a man who made a career out of portraying ordinary heroes, perhaps his greatest act of authenticity was living quietly, under the vast and endless Montana sky. Katharine Hepburn, the Queen of Independence, in her own kingdom. Katharine Hepburn was never like other stars. Fiercely independent, sharp-witted, and unapologetically herself, she carved out a career that defied Hollywood's rules. For Academy Awards, countless unforgettable performances, and yet Hepburn's heart was never in the glitz. When the cameras stopped, she didn't linger in Los Angeles or chase the next party. She went home to Fenwick, her family's sprawling estate on the Connecticut shoreline. There, the noise of Hollywood was replaced by the sound of waves against the rocks and the cry of seabirds overhead. She lived in comfortable seclusion, wearing old sweaters and slacks, walking her property with the same determination she brought to every role. This state wasn't a polished showplace. It was lived in, functional, and filled with the small comforts she loved. Hepburn's days were her own. She swam in the ocean even in cold weather, gardened for hours, and spent long afternoons reading by the water. Neighbors knew her, but they respected her privacy, and she was rarely bothered. Work was something she chose carefully. If a script drew her in, she would reappear like a comet, dazzling for a moment before retreating again. For Hepburn, Fenwick was more than a retreat. It was proof that a woman could live on her own terms, unbothered by public expectations. And in the quiet rhythm of the tides, she found a kind of freedom even the most glittering stage could never offer. Audrey Hepburn, the angel who vanished into the hills. Audrey Hepburn was the very picture of grace. From Breakfast at Tiffany's to Roman Holiday, she became a timeless symbol of elegance, kindness, and charm. Her face was instantly recognizable, her style imitated across the globe. But in the later chapters of her life, Hepburn stepped away from the constant attention of the film world and sought peace in a place far removed from the flash of cameras, the Swiss countryside. Her home was in Tollequinaz, a quiet village surrounded by rolling hills, vineyards, and views of Lake Geneva. Here, there were no screaming fans or flashing lights, just the sound of church bells and the gentle rhythm of rural life. Hepburn filled her days with simple joys, walking her dogs, tending to her garden, cooking for close friends, and cycling along peaceful country roads. The people of Tollequinaz treated her not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor. Though she still appeared in public for humanitarian work, most notably as a UNICEF ambassador, her life in Switzerland was slow and deeply personal. She chose projects out of passion, not obligation, and returned home quickly after each trip. For Hepburn, this retreat was not an escape from fame, but a return to what mattered most: family, kindness, and the beauty of living quietly. In the stillness of the Swiss hills, she discovered the rarest treasure a global star could ever find: a truly private life. Bette Davis, the grande dame in the New England quiet. Bette Davis was Hollywood's fighter, a woman whose fierce talent and determination earned her 2 Academy Awards and a reputation as one of the greatest actresses to ever grace the screen. She was bold, uncompromising, and completely unafraid to speak her mind. But behind that fiery public persona, Davis cherished something far more subdued: the peace of her rural home in New Hampshire. Nestled in the rolling countryside, her house was surrounded by tall trees, crisp air, and the stillness that only comes when you're miles away from a nearest city. Here, she traded glamorous gowns for comfortable sweaters and long walks through the woods. The pace was slow, but it suited her, a welcome contrast to the high-pressure studio sets and endless publicity tours that had once filled her days. Neighbors described her as approachable, warm, and surprisingly down-to-earth in these surroundings. She enjoyed quiet evenings by the fire, writing letters, reading, and cooking for guests she personally invited. Work never truly left her life. She still accepted acting roles well into her later years, but between projects, she retreated to New Hampshire like a ship returning safely to harbor. In that New England calm, Davis could set down the armor she wore in Hollywood. There were no cameras to please, no battles to fight, just the rhythm of the seasons, the comfort of home, and the satisfaction of living life exactly as she wished. Olivia de Havilland, the lady who found peace in Paris. Olivia de Havilland was elegance in motion. Known for her roles in Gone with the Wind and a string of classic dramas, she was one of the last great links to Hollywood's golden age. Yet while many stars spent their later years in Los Angeles, de Havilland made a bold and lasting choice. She moved to Paris. Not for a film, not for a brief escape, but for good. Her life in the French capital was worlds apart from Hollywood's constant chatter. She lived in a beautiful apartment near the Seine, surrounded by books, flowers, and quiet charm. The streets outside bustled with cafe life and the soft hum of conversation, but Olivia's days were slow and deliberate. She strolled the city's gardens, attended the occasional cultural event, and savored the art, food, and history at her doorstep. Unlike some who go off the grid entirely, de Havilland remained socially engaged, forming deep friendships and welcoming select guests into her home. But the frenzy of the entertainment industry was far behind her. Paris offered her a stage without spotlights, a place where she could be herself, free from the weight of celebrity. She stayed there for decades, becoming a quiet, dignified figure in her adopted city. In Paris, Olivia de Havilland lived life like a timeless novel, richly detailed, beautifully paced, and entirely her own. Myrna Loy, the sophisticate who slipped into the city's shadows. Myrna Loy was the definition of screen sophistication. From the Thin Man series to a wide range of dramatic roles, she charmed audiences with intelligence, wit, and effortless grace. But when her Hollywood years wound down, Loy didn't linger in the spotlight or make a public farewell. Instead, she quietly left the studio system behind and moved to New York City, not to live in the glare of Broadway, but to blend into the rhythm of everyday life. Her apartment was comfortable but unpretentious, a place filled with books, personal mementos, and the warmth of a life lived fully. In the city, she could walk through crowded streets without constant recognition, becoming just another face in the flow of people. She dined at neighborhood spots, visited museums, and enjoyed the cultural richness of New York on her own terms. Although she occasionally returned for select projects, Loy had no interest in chasing the next headline. Friends recalled her humor, her deep sense of loyalty, and her ability to slip effortlessly between the glamour of her past and the simplicity of her chosen present. In Manhattan, Myrna Loy mastered the art of quiet independence, living without the pressure of public expectations, surrounded by a city that gave her both anonymity and inspiration. For a woman once known as Hollywood's perfect lady, her most graceful role might have been the one where no one was watching. Elizabeth Taylor, the legend who closed the gates. Elizabeth Taylor was one of the most photographed women in the world, a star whose violet eyes, iconic roles, and unforgettable presence made her a symbol of classic Hollywood glamour. For decades, she lived in the glare of the public eye, her life documented in headlines and flashbulbs. But in her later years, Taylor made a choice that surprised many. She stepped away from the constant visibility and retreated into a private, protected world. Her sanctuary was her home in Bel Air, a sprawling estate surrounded by lush gardens, high walls, and wrought iron gates. Inside, the pace of life slowed. She filled her home with art, flowers, and the laughter of close friends and family. Instead of red carpets, her days revolved around quiet mornings on the terrace, afternoons tending to her beloved pets, and evenings spent in warm, private gatherings. Though she still appeared for causes close to her heart, especially her groundbreaking humanitarian work, she kept her public appearances rare. Taylor preferred to let the world remember her in her own way, controlling when and how she emerged. In those final years, Elizabeth Taylor proved that even the most dazzling star could choose a quieter orbit. Behind the gates, she was free to live as simply or extravagantly as she pleased, no longer defined by the camera's gaze, but by the life she had built for herself. James Dean, the rebel who kept to the back roads. James Dean became a legend almost overnight. With just 3 major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, he captured a generation's restless spirit. Yet off-screen, Dean was far from the noisy Hollywood scene. He preferred the open spaces and quiet roads of rural California, where he could live without the constant buzz of the industry. He spent much of his free time in Fairmount, Indiana, the small town where he was raised, and on a modest property in the countryside. There, Dean embraced a simple routine, riding his motorcycle along winding roads, working on his beloved sports cars, and spending hours sketching or playing the bongos. Friends knew him as a man who could disappear for days, heading out to explore without a fixed plan, letting the world's noise fade in the rearview mirror. While his career had just begun to soar, Dean seemed to crave balance, a way to keep his craft alive without losing himself in fame's demands. He avoided big Hollywood parties, preferring diners, back-road gas stations, and quiet late-night conversations with a handful of trusted companions. Though his life was tragically short, James Dean's time away from the spotlight showed a different side of the rebel icon, not just the restless star, but a young man who found peace in simplicity, speed, and the wide-open spaces far from the camera's reach. We've journeyed through the quiet corners where Hollywood's brightest lights chose to fade, from Garbo's shadowed New York walks to Brando's private island, from Hepburn's oceanfront sanctuary to Dean's winding back roads. Each one stepped away from the endless applause, proving that sometimes the truest freedom comes not from being seen, but from choosing when and how to be seen. And now the surprise we promised. Of all these legendary figures, the one who lived the most completely off the grid wasn't the one on a faraway island or hidden in mountain ranges. It was Greta Garbo. For over half a century, she vanished from the public stage, leaving behind only a handful of photographs and brief sightings. In an age before social media, she achieved what seems impossible today. She truly disappeared, living an entire lifetime without the world watching. Her quiet defiance remains unmatched, a reminder that even the brightest stars can choose the deepest shade. These stories aren't just about escape, they're about reclaiming life on one's own terms. Whether it was the solitude of ranchland, the stillness of a Paris street, or the calm of a Swiss garden, each of these legends found a way to step out of the glare and into something more real. If you enjoyed traveling through these hidden chapters of Hollywood history, give this video a like, subscribe for more untold stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which star's retreat surprised you the most?